So let's start. Good afternoon, dear partners, friends, and colleagues, and welcome to our first webinar within the recov.ge platform. As you know, today our topic is how and when the hotel sector will emerge from the crisis, where of course we will look into the regional trends, and of course our focus today will be Georgia. My name is Irakli Kilauridze, and I am a member of Colliers Georgia team that has put together this conference, and I would like to take this opportunity and thank everyone who is contributing to this project, our team members and our partners. We'll try to make this session today very interactive, therefore please do send us your questions through the Q&A section in Zoom, and if you are joining us from Facebook Live, please post your questions in comment section. We'll have our team members monitoring both channels and supplying us with your questions. We might not have, of course, enough time to answer all the questions, but we will try to address them after the session through the direct communication with you. To mention, the copy of the video recording and the presentation slides of this conference will be posted on the recov.ge and of course on the Colliers Georgia Facebook page. And so you will get all the content that we'll be discussing today. Before I introduce you to our key speaker, just a few words about recov.ge. Colliers decided to contribute with its quality data from the market and also several highlights of possible opportunities that we all could take advantage of while managing through this, I would say, quite interesting and unprecedented times, and importantly to assist market players to make informed and educated decisions. Today we are going to talk about, of course, hotels, and for this topic we have chosen acclaimed hotel industry expert, I would say, in the EMEA region, our colleague and dear friend, Marc Finney, who is head of hospitality and resort consulting in Colliers. Marc knows Georgia very well, and I think this makes him quite unique expert for us. He started his projects in Georgia more than 10 years ago, and he's been involved in a number of major hotel projects in Tbilisi and in Georgia as well, in other regions. Some of the selected projects of Marc are Hilton Garden Inn, Sheraton Metehi Palace, the Radisson Telegraph, Radisson Sinandali, hotels in Abastumani and in Zaltubo. And Marc has also worked on the feasibility and master plan of former polygon territory in Gonio, in Ajara region. Just a few words on the proposed content for today's session, and we'll start with Marc's presentation and some insights from EMEA region and also opportunities for Georgia. After that, I will present you some data from tourism and hospitality sector that we have at hand. And after that, probably we'll go to most interesting part of our session, that's Q&A. We already have a couple of very interesting questions from the market, which we will ask Marc. We will have also a couple of polls that we ask to participants to answer these polls. These answers will be confidential, and your your choices will not be posted, but we'll post the general kind of sentiment based on these polls, and I think it will be very interesting for all of us to see how the market sentiments are here today in Tbilisi and in other parts of Georgia. Now, without any further delay, I would like to give stage to Marc with his presentation. Marc?
Okay, thank you, Irakli. Thank you for that introduction, and Galmarjaba to everybody. Thank you for giving me your attention. I'm going to just try and load this presentation now.
Now we can see it, Marc.
Okay, I just need to get that. So is that better?
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a brief presentation today, just outlining some of the early indicators that we have about how this crisis might start to evolve going forward. We've all been locked at home for a number of weeks or months now, depending on which part of the world you're in. And it's time, I think, for all of us to start thinking about how we come out of this. And one of the things that we always do when we're looking to the future is let's see what the lessons of the past are. And we don't really have a past for this because this is a very unique situation. But in the past, we have had epidemics in isolated areas like the SARS epidemic, which affected the Far East very much. The Zika virus and the MERS have affected different areas at different times. And what that showed in the past was that very much there was a very steep decline, obviously almost a standstill in the business, but then a very, very steep recovery afterwards. It's what they call the V-shaped recovery. Now, unfortunately, in this case, I don't think we're getting the V-shaped recovery. And the main reason for that is because this is not just affecting one region, it's affecting the whole world. In fact, it's a global pandemic. And as a result, all countries have shut down and done their different lockdowns at different times. So because we are a very much interconnected world economy nowadays, the globalization has meant that the fact that your own country has solved the problem doesn't mean that your customers and the people that might visit you have solved theirs. So we're very dependent upon each other now. So the recovery this time is going to be slower. And just a sort of indication of the scale of the problem, this slide here shows the percentage of hotels across the world which are currently closed. This was at the end of April, so it's a little bit out of date, but it shows the percentage of hotels that were actually closed to the public. So as you can see, in various parts of the world, very large percentages. If we look a little bit closer to home at the percentage of hotels that were closed in April, you can see, again, some big variations. Tbilisi, 87%. Athens did a very early lockdown. Madrid, Rome, Barcelona, very strong lockdowns. So you can see that by the end of April, a lot of hotels were closed. In the UK, we have 78% of hotels closed, but even the ones that were open were not really open for business. It was more looking after health workers and emergency workers who were dealing with the crisis. And I guess in most of these locations where you see a high percentage of hotels closed, the ones which were open were basically dealing with non-traditional hotel business. There were some countries you see here, Moscow, for example, where they decided they didn't have a crisis there yet. But if we looked at that picture today, it would be very different. So there is the crisis has affected countries at different times. But this is very dramatic. And if you were to imagine a crisis that would most affect the hotel sector, it's something like this. You know, even in the financial crash, the hotel sector was still able to find business. Maybe the profits were down a little bit. Maybe there was 30%, 40% down. But here we went from 100% to zero in 2 weeks. So it's the most dramatic crisis that there has ever been in living memory as it affects the hotel sector. Even during world wars, hotels remained open and had customers. So really this is a crisis that has not been seen before. And clearly the road back from it will be a little bit more difficult. So again, you know, if we look at the crisis last time in the SARS event, you know, we have a very different world today. At that time, there were 20 million Chinese tourists leaving the country. In 2019, there was 160 million. So all of those 160 million people for very many months have not been able to travel. So there's a whole huge area of demand that has been stopped. The other thing that has stopped this time is global shutdown of the airline sector. And, you know, every single major airline has either stopped flying or really minimized the amount of flights they have available. A lot of pilots have been laid off or furloughed, or even in some cases made redundant. And a lot of airlines have even returned the planes to the leasing companies. So even if we said tomorrow that the traveling can start again, it would take many months before the airline industry was able to reach capacity. In fact, I saw a report recently that said that even at the end of 2021, the airlines will only be able to reach about 80% of their previous 2019 capacity. So that is clearly also going to affect tourism and also hotel occupancy. This is probably my favorite chart at the moment because it shows that the recovery, which has been going for, I guess, the longest in China, is definitely not showing the V-shaped recovery that we would hope for. It's very much a U, or maybe even a little bit of a what they call a W, where maybe you'll have a second peak. Hopefully not, but maybe there will be a second peak. But even in China, you can see that the occupancies are not recovering to anything like the levels that they were at before the crisis. So typically, before the crisis, hotels would have been running around 70% occupancy in China. Obviously, they had their crisis earlier and they're recovering now, but still below 50%. Even in the best cases, there's very few hotels doing more than 50%. So why is that? That's mainly because of the type of business that's coming back. It's entirely domestic in China. They haven't got any international travelers yet. And obviously they rely a lot on international travelers to fill their hotels. And that's clearly not happening. The US, which has kind of taken an attitude a little bit of slightly ignoring the crisis. Obviously their hotel occupancies have recovered a little bit, but it's come at a great expense. And I think we probably saw in the news today that America has reached 100,000 deaths already from the virus. So this kind of slightly more relaxed attitude has come at a high price in terms of public health. Europe, we see, hasn't really started to move yet. It's basically down at 10% occupancy of hotels. And this 10% occupancy is entirely related to emergency workers. We have seen a few hotels in a few locations starting to open up. But even in those countries like Denmark, which never really closed the hotels, there's been very little or even no business that isn't related to national kind of emergency recovery. On the slide here, we've just shown a number of countries and the key statistics. I don't have all of the data here for Georgia, unfortunately, but we can talk about that a little bit in Irakli's presentation, which is just about to come. What we see here is, a chart which shows the opening of hotels across Europe. And my understanding now is that if we were to place Georgia, it would be on the 8th of June for the reopening of hotels. So
yeah, it's very recent, Mark. We decided that 8th of June is the new date for the basically reopening the whole economy in Georgia.
So that would place you nicely in the middle here. So obviously opening a little bit later than some other countries who maybe had slightly earlier lockdowns, but certainly before places like the UK, like France, and like Greece, who are all expected to open over the coming months. However, I think there's a big discussion, and maybe we'll come and touch on that point earlier, is the fact that you have permission to open doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. And I think individual hotels will have to make that decision as to whether they can match their break-even point. So what does that all mean? So what is our view of how the market will open up? Obviously, we've already seen in May some hotels opening in Europe, but with very, very low levels of occupancy and very low levels of business. And anything which it has been so far has been mostly crisis-related movement, or maybe very small amounts of business. We do see that picking up during the month of June, but it will only really be July and August before we see any significant amounts of travel. And I do wonder, even in places like Spain and Portugal and Greece, even if they do manage to open their tourism industry, I suspect that it will be still mostly domestic visitors going, because a lot of countries will still not have the access rights. There's a lot of discussion about air bridges and tourism corridors, which I think will be helpful, and I think we will see more and more of that. But whether they come in time to save this season for people, I don't know. And even the markets which usually generate a lot of tourists, like Germany, like the UK, like France, it will still be a big step for people to have the courage to go to a new country where they don't know the system, they don't know the medical arrangements. It'll be difficult for people to travel in large numbers for tourism. So I suspect that it might be a while before we see that. I think we'll see the domestic market recover quite strongly, both in business and in tourism. So I think if I was a hotelier in Georgia now, I would be looking specifically targeting the domestic market, because I think the potential will be mostly there in the very early stages. And then by the end of Q4 of this year, hopefully the domestic market is fully recovered, and we'll start to see during next year the opening more of the international market. And last of all, we will see the big events and MICE business returning, because that will be the last piece of business, I think, to recover, given the social distancing. And maybe that doesn't even recover at all until we have either a virus or a vaccine or a cure. So I think that's our brief summary. Very happy to do questions. I think first,
thank you, Marc, very much for this presentation. Maybe I will do a quick presentation on Georgia to be. Let's focus on Georgia, yeah, more. Yeah. And
so let me. If I stop sharing, you should be able to do yours now.
Yeah. And okay, so let me start with the first slide. Hold on. Yeah, first, what I wanted to draw our guests' attention is this stringency index, which is actually tells you how strict the government, let's say, regulations were during this pandemic. And you will see on the chart that we are kind of in top, let's say, countries that taking quite active measures to retain this virus. And I think for the tourism and for the, let's say, promotion and marketing of Georgia as a tourism destination, this is quite good, because there's also a lot of discussions now within the government to actually market Georgia as a, let's say, COVID-free environment where our tourists and our guests come freely. And we think that after this restrictions are lifted, I think our, let's say, rating will go down, which is not bad, it's good. And therefore, we've taken quite active measures in times when it's needed, and now we're letting it go. So in that terms, I think we're doing quite good. But as you mentioned, it's very important to look at the region, because Georgia is a small country, and every tourist and every visitor, they're looking what's happening in the region. And unfortunately, there we don't have a very good situation. As we all know, our biggest northern neighbor, and which is one of the biggest, our target markets, Russia, is having quite big problems at the moment. They have more than 9,000 cases every day, and in Turkey it's 1,000. However, Turkey seems to be more successful in managing the outbreak than Russia. It's good to mention also that Armenia and Azerbaijan are still on the peak phase, but we think this will end, and these two markets are also kind of traditional markets for Georgia. Of course, Georgia is not on the chart here because, as I mentioned earlier, we managed quite well, so our daily confirmed cases are less than 30. On this slide, we actually try to show where the Georgia is positioned in terms of what kind of effect it will have on Georgian economy. And Georgian tourism is not very much dependent on local tourism. It's only 27% that is coming from the local sector. But the total tourism industry plays quite a big role. It's around 8% of total gross domestic product. So it will have effect on Georgian economy. there is also a possibility that Georgians are spending around $2 billion going outbound and let's say spending their vacations outside. There are some ideas how to, let's say, revert this amount and spend in local tourism. But of course, that very much depends if those people want to spend and if they can spend and they have enough income after this pandemic to spend in Georgia. This is the breakdown of our traditional markets. As you will see from the chart, Russia is the biggest market for Georgia. Tourism industry is 23% of the total visitors. Then it comes Azerbaijan, 19%, Turkey, Armenia, Ukraine, EU in total, European countries are 12%, and other countries are 18%. Here, I think it's very important to mention that there are some talks and all of the negotiations with some countries, as you mentioned, Marc, that to opening up these tourism corridors, right? And currently we are discussing these tourism corridors with Austria, Estonia, Israel, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, and Czech. But the biggest market for us is Israel, of course, is more than 200,000 people visited from Israel last year. But in total, those markets make not more than 7.5%. So it will help, but it's not that significant that, and we think it will not have a big kind of effect. As for the recovery, as I mentioned, our tourism industry very much depends on the international tourism. It's more than 70%. And it's very much important in this situation how quickly we open the borders, how quickly we open the businesses. But at the same time, as you mentioned, it's very much dependent on how our target markets are doing. And if they open the borders, and after that, if the people are willing to travel because of that. And we all know that season is already here. It's like a couple of days from June, which is quite active already in Georgia. But I think in general, we can say that we will have a gradual recovery. So we are falling here on the left upper side of the corner. And of course, it very much depends how other countries will be responding. This is very recent data. As you know, we are doing the real estate sector research every year, and we are now finalizing 2018 and 2019 figures. These are very recent numbers from this research. Actually shows the hotel supply in Georgia. This is important because we need to analyze each sector separately because we might have different strategies for each sector, and different sectors might recover earlier or later. So today we have a situation that more than 80% of hotel room supply belongs to local mid-scale and budget hotels. That's data for Tbilisi, Batumi, and Kutaisi. And highest supply of hotel rooms are in the seaside. So on the chart you can see also by colors international upscale, international mid-scale, local mid-scale, and budget. It's also very interesting to see what is the coming supply. So those projects that are under development, under construction. So in total, we have for the next 3 years, we have more than 5,000 rooms coming to the market. If those projects that are started, of course, they will not be paused and will not be postponed. So mostly it's again in Tbilisi, it's more than 3,300 rooms here in Tbilisi, Batumi 1,500, and just over 200 rooms in Kutaisi. And again, future supply by resort types, the biggest is the mountain. And I think this was one of the underestimated parts of our tourism. And I think the industry is picking up now and supplying quite a few rooms, I would say, for the mountain resorting in Georgia. We'll get back to this slide when we'll be talking about some of the questions, because it will play a major role in total industry. And I think that's it. So, Marc, what I will do now is I will go to the questions that we gathered from the market in the last couple of days, and we're going to have also one of our first polls now. So first, my question would be, what should be the strategy for hotels by class, right? To open and work on low or no occupancy. It depends very much on the hotel, or to close the hotel operations and wait until the crisis is over.
Mm-hmm.
What is your
okay? Good question. In fact, I see that as two questions, so I'll answer them separately. So, the first question I see as being the class of hotel that's most likely to recover first, etc., and then secondly, whether to open or not. So, I would say primarily, and what we've seen happening in China, for example, already, is that the hotels which have recovered quickest have been the budget and mid-scale hotels. So it's been the hotels offering, I would say, a more basic accommodation for people who need to travel, whether that's for business or for tourism or whatever. But what we definitely see is a very clear trend that budget and 3-star hotels have recovered much more quickly than 4 and 5-star hotels. So if we start to think about some of the reasons why that might be, I think it's probably because of the component of domestic market. So a lot of these budget hotels tend to be more occupied by domestic market in whichever country you're in. So in China, for example, the local Chinese, if they're traveling, they'll be much more comfortable staying in a budget hotel than maybe an international traveler is. Maybe he wants something a little bit better. I've come a long way. I want to find something which is a little bit more in keeping with my quality expectations. So as a general rule, I would say the budget hotels will be the ones that recover the first and the quickest, but largely because they are dependent on the domestic market. If you have a budget hotel that relies a lot on international market, probably that will take a little bit longer to recover. And then as you go up the luxury scale, the slower the recovery tends to be. So I would say luxury, unfortunately, will be the last sector to recover. Then below that will be your kind of 4-star business, full service kind of hotel. And then quickest to recover will be the budget hotels. Now that might vary location to location, but as a general rule, I would say that is what our thinking would be. I would say in terms of reopening your property, it's very important to understand in your own business, where is your break-even point? You know, there will be some hotels who can find a break-even point with even 20, 30% occupancy. Others might need 50, 60% occupancy just to cover the fixed costs. So it will be very important to start with to find the confidence that you will be able to reach your break-even point within, say, 2 or 3 weeks of opening. Obviously, the first week will always be a bit difficult, but if you cannot see a way to getting to your break-even point within those first 3 or 4 weeks, then it will be a dangerous strategy, because you might end up losing more money open than you do closed. And even a hotel which is closed kind of usually has some costs, so there is some burn, if you like, with an empty hotel. But with a hotel that you're thinking of reopening, you will be bringing back a lot of additional cost into your business. You'll be bringing back staff, you'll be bringing back all sorts of other things. And also what you have to understand is that your operating costs, certainly for the next year or two, might be a little bit higher. You might need to allow your room cleaners a little bit longer to clean the rooms. You might need to invest a little bit more in cleaning and chemicals and measures to counter virus to give people confidence. You might need to put more spacing in your restaurants. You might need to change the way that you do a breakfast service, for example. Instead of a buffet, you might have to do a direct service. And all of this will add some cost, so you need to take that into consideration as well.
Based on that, Mark, do you think that in this case, the smaller, let's say, hotels might have some, let's say, this financial or profitability advantage than the bigger hotels? Mostly bigger hotels are operated by international brands. Can you put it that way? That it's.
I think there is potential in the very early stages for a smaller hotel to more quickly achieve its break-even point, but. Okay. Obviously, the advantages of a larger hotel, once you have reached your break-even point, your profitability can increase much more quickly after that. So if I was to say, I would expect a smaller hotel to reach the break even more quickly, but once it's reached the break even, the international hotel or the larger properties will definitely benefit more from having achieved that level of business. So if we looked at that chart earlier where we saw in China after 2 months, there's still only around 40–45% occupancy. If I was a hotel owner now, I would be hoping that if I believed I could be break even with 40% occupancy, I would be thinking about opening and hoping to achieve that within 1 to 2 months.
Okay.
If my break even point is 50 or 60% occupancy, and I can only see potential occupancy of 40%, then probably the best thing is to just stay closed for a little bit longer and maybe wait a bit or wait a little bit until the international travel has started a bit more.
Okay, thank you. Which customer segments should the hotels expect first? First is, of course, the full independent travelers, tours, corporate, MICE. What is your view on that?
I think, again, on the basis that the domestic market comes back first, I think you'll find people who have to travel or need to travel or want to travel will come first. So what we're finding is local business people who need to travel to a different part of the country in order to do their business, that will come first. There will be a lot of salesmen at the moment who are stuck in their houses and want to get out and meet their customers again, and they will need to travel to do that. And so, I can see this kind of domestic travel coming back quite strongly. I also think from a leisure point of view, the domestic market you'll see a lot of leisure travel. Again, we've been stuck in our houses for, depending on where you are, 10, 12 weeks. And people want to get out and they want to go and see new places, get some fresh air, go to the seaside, go into the mountains. And I think that you will see a lot of demand for this kind of release from this kind of very strained environment that we have all been living under. So I think those segments I would see first. So there will all be independent travelers making their own bookings, and corporate travelers. I think it will then be a long time before we see groups of travelers coming again, simply because this requires, you mentioned earlier that you had an air bridge coming with Israel. So in that country, you need to have somebody who will organize these tourists, you need to have the flights, you need to have the accommodation, need to all be packaged. And I see this taking a bit of time. I wouldn't say you have missed this season, but I think this season will be a small season, and that I wouldn't see that recovering too much until next year. And certainly business trips where you have people, conferences, for example, people coming from different countries around the world, meeting in one location. I think it will be at least next year and maybe even the year after before we see this coming with any significant travel.
Yeah, what is interesting, we just had the results from the poll, and we see that the sentiment market in Georgia is that 40% are planning to open immediately. So mentally they're ready to do it. And 24% in July, so they will wait probably another month, 14% in August, and 10% probably they will do autumn, winter, and only 12% first half of 2021. So we could say that the sentiments are quite positive.
There's a confidence there, which is good. It's great to see, and I'm very pleased to see those kind of results there. I think it's I can understand the desire to open and be back at work, and I fully understand that. But I do think the only caution I would say is just make sure that you can see a way to being profitable before you finally make that decision. But
to at least cover the costs, right? Not to
exactly, at least not to lose more money.
Right.
But also I can also see that there is an advantage if you're one of the first hotels to open and some others are still closed.
Right.
You're opening into a market which is maybe a little bit undersupplied, so maybe you have the advantage to do that. So the only thing I would say is very important when you do open to make sure that you are aware that it's not opening like before. You know, maybe you open to start with just bed and breakfast, and then you leave your restaurants a little bit later. Maybe you have special times for breakfast so that people don't all arrive at the same time, that you can do some distancing in the restaurant. Maybe you don't open the bar immediately because this is a place where people would congregate. So I think you have to respect the safety of customers first. And once you have achieved that, you can, it's very easy if you have your bedrooms open to then open the restaurant. But if you open everything all at once, you could lead to a situation that might create some difficulties.
Okay.
You know, we're already looking at, you already need to start looking at real details, like if you have a lift, do you allow people to use the lift? Do they have to walk up the stairs, or is it a rule one person in the lift at a time? You know, this kind of very small details that are very important, and your customers will notice the attention that you have given to that. If they think that you're not looking after them, they will find another option.
Okay. Okay, so the next question we have, can Georgia as a developing but safe country be interesting, safe in terms probably as a COVID safe, be interesting for the EU and UK citizens more than before? Let's say if it's an opportunity for us, if we market Georgia as a COVID-free or a very small COVID infection, let's say, spread, if it will be interesting for the new market, because EU is only 12% of our total target market, but could be this used as a, let's say, advantage to find the new markets and increase the share of the tourism from those countries? What is your view on that?
I definitely think so. I think the answer is from European Union, definitely. And I think what you just need to be very careful is you've got a very low incidence of cases now. And if you start opening the market too quickly to some of these countries where the disease is still more prevalent, then you run the risk that you allow the disease into your country. So I think as long as you choose those partners carefully, you know, maybe for example, at the moment in Europe, Germany, some of the Nordic countries have very low incidences now, so they might be ready to accept tourism. I know Greece is playing this card very strongly at the moment, so they are claiming also to be a very low COVID country. They had a very early lockdown. They seem to have done a good job of keeping cases very restricted. So I do believe that that they will benefit this year. They seem to have got ahead of places like, for example, Spain and Italy, where I think it will be a long time before people trust to go to those right. countries where they had a very big outbreak and it wasn't controlled in those places. So I definitely think there is an opportunity, but it will depend on A, having airlift so that the flights are operating, and B, having a safe country that you can partner with, because the last thing you want to do is do a partnership with a country that brings you a lot of tourists, spreads the disease, and then you have a second peak, if you like.
Yeah, this is very kind of, we need to manage it very carefully, yeah, because our biggest markets, unfortunately, are not handling that well in the airport. So yeah, if we open up the borders and we have another peak here, yeah, we might ruin our reputation that I think we managed to have in the last several weeks.
But certainly, and I mean, from the UK market, for example, when it's safe for us to travel again, and when people are ready to receive us, I've always said that the first country that opens its doors to UK citizens will have a small boom, because there are a lot of people who have been in their houses for 12 weeks and they desperately want to get outside and have some new experiences.
Okay, Marc, what do you think? Let's a little bit talk about the relationship with the hotel owners and the management companies, operators. From your experience, do you see any changes in the operating contracts that they have, or franchise contracts, or are there any movements in last, let's say, several weeks? And what is the general position of these big operators that we all have in Georgia? And of course, the position of the investors and the owners of those hotels?
Yeah. I mean, I think generally the brands have been quite helpful and quite flexible and quite understanding. Obviously, they have a lot of owners who have got a lot of difficulties at the moment.
Right.
And what we have to understand is the hotel companies themselves have got their own difficulties. You know, the revenue of a hotel company under a management contract is directly linked to revenues. So if they don't have any revenues, they don't get any pay, and therefore their income is also now zero. I mean, at one time, Marriott had 300 hotels in Europe, and I think 2 of them were open. All the others were shut. So this is a very dramatic change in the income to Marriott, but they still had their sales forces, they still had their organization costs to cover. So it was a big, they still have their IT bills to pay, their subscriptions, etc. So it's hit the operating companies very hard. And what I think you are seeing is operators and owners trying to work together to find the best solution that works for them. I was on a call the other day, which was a Hilton owners call. So people who own Hilton hotels, they had a webinar for them, partly explaining about the crisis, but also explaining that they were ready to be as helpful as they could be. Having said that, there was also some comments in the chat line that there were some invoices still being issued by Hilton that weren't being paid, and that they should be a bit more understanding with that. And so there's clearly going to be a little bit of friction. But I think if both parties understand that they are enduring a difficult time and that the best way to come out of this is together, I think that you will get the best result. In terms of going forward, in new contracts, we're already seeing the impacts of the crisis. I have to say, I've already seen my first pandemic clause in a new contract that I was signing with a client for Radisson. So already these pandemic clauses are starting to appear. And I'm also seeing some of the operators saying, okay, we need to have a kind of minimum base fee if an event like this happens again, so that we can at least keep our sales offices open, etc. So I think you might see a kind of marketing fee in the future, which is not just a percentage of sales, but also related to a fixed element. But the other big thing that came out of that, and I imagine this has been an issue in Georgia as well, a lot of under these management agreements, the brands insist on a business interruption insurance. So in other words, that you take out an insurance that covers you in case there is a loss of business. Now, this is a clear case where there is a loss of business, but all of the insurance companies are saying, oh, no, this is not what we intended. And this is actually, although you thought you were insured, you're not insured for this kind of thing. And if you read this small letter on page 579 of your contract, you will see that we are right. And in fact, a lot of people who thought they were insured have found out that they're not. And I think that this will be a problem across the whole world. And I think what you will see in future are specific insurance policies which will cover this kind of eventuality, and specific insurance policies which will not cover this kind of eventuality.
Right.
And since we're talking about an event which happens once every maybe 100 years, maybe it's something which you take the risk with.
Thank you, Marc. The next question is, what are the prospects for the new hotel that are in supply right now? And for instance, if I am a developer who is developing hotel, and of course it depends on which stage of the development my project is, what would be your advice? Should they stop and wait? Should they continue? Should they, I don't know, revisit the concept, maybe change the target markets? And another question, which is also coming in terms of the investments, do you think this will somehow have an investment effect on the investment? Because mostly Georgian market is very much dependent on the FDI, foreign direct investment. So what is your take on that? And we'll have a quick poll here as well. What is the market sentiment while you answer?
Yeah. I mean, the best way for me to answer is to look at what my current clients are doing. So in the UK, I'm working on 30 projects with about 8,000 new rooms just in the UK, and probably the same again outside of the UK.
Right.
So if I look at the clients, I would say of these clients, the majority, probably 50%, maybe even 60%, are carrying on with their projects. And the view there is, okay, my project is not going to open for at least 2 years or 18 months. By that time, hopefully this problem is solved, so we will carry on and we will develop. And I still believe this is the right thing to do. Then I would say I have another 30, 40% of clients who are probably saying, okay, we're going to carry on, we'll get the planning permission, we will negotiate the contracts, but we maybe don't sign them yet. We will start talking to the banks about funding, but we're not going to sign a term sheet until we're 100. So they're kind of delaying the decision to proceed, but making sure that they use this time to move everything forward. And then I have about 10% of clients who have just said, okay, go away, I will speak to you in a year's time if I'm still interested, you know. So it's kind of, I would say most people are proceeding, but you made a very good point earlier that it's a very good time to just review what it is that you're doing, maybe take a little bit longer, maybe just sit and think for a week or two, okay, am I doing the right thing? Is it the right market position? Is this particular project that I'm doing, is it going to be more or less affected by this kind of disease in the future, and also how people might react going forward? So if I was developing a super luxury hotel at the moment, I might be thinking, okay, maybe I just calm down and see how the luxury market recovers before I press the button. But if I was developing a relatively simple hotel, I think, you know, it would be just a question of carrying on, doing as much as I can, but maybe the opening gets a little bit delayed because I have to take a little bit longer to make my decision.
So what is the sentiment here? Just to share with you the results for our participants. So 22% they stopped the development temporarily. So actually they took this cautious strategy. 11% changed nothing and continued construction development. So it's quite a small portion. The biggest part is 57% is modified the development timeline. So basically they looked at when they want to open, maybe a bit earlier. And again, 11% modified the hotel concept. So this is a sentiment in Georgia. So majority, I think they have mostly kind of a positive view on the market and carrying on. It's only 22% that they just stopped the project, which is not bad, I would say.
Yeah, and of that 22%, I would imagine about half might never proceed and half might proceed, but with a different time.
Maybe we're changing the concept and
I think if you look at that structure, that's probably very similar to exactly what I've just been saying, in that the majority of people are either going ahead, they may be going ahead a bit more slowly, but they're kind of moving things along, doing things which doesn't involve a lot of investment. So for example, the planning process, you know, this can take a long time, but it doesn't necessarily cost a huge amount of money. So maybe people will continue with that. Maybe you get all of the negotiation of your management contract agreed, but you don't actually sign it until you're ready to proceed. The one thing that we have noticed in Western Europe is that obviously banks are feeling the crisis quite a lot. They maybe have been shielded a little bit by some of these government measures that have kept businesses from going bust, but I think they are expecting later this year to have a big number of loans which maybe default or at very least breach the covenants. And as a result of that, what we're seeing in Western Europe is that a lot of the banks are conserving cash, which means that their ability to lend, particularly to new developments, if it's an existing hotel where they can see the cash flow already, it's probably easier. But I think development finance will be more difficult. Certainly for the next 6 months, probably the next year. Doesn't mean it won't be available, but it will be more difficult.
So even for those projects that are already, let's say, in the development phase and banks starting, let's say, disbursing the loans, you see...
I think if there's already a loan agreement in place, it will be difficult for the bank to change that. Okay. But if they are not yet committed, I would imagine that, I mean, what we've seen here is not them saying, no, we won't lend, but they will maybe lend a little bit less. So instead of maybe 60% of value, they might lend only 40 or 50% of value. And so
leverage ratios will change.
the quantum.
You will need more equity capital to fund your development.
Correct. I think you might need more equity capital, and you might find that the loan is smaller and maybe a little bit more expensive.
Okay. We have a couple of other questions. One interesting question is about Airbnb market in Georgia. Okay, this market in Georgia, in Tbilisi, been quite disturbing for the hotel operators, and especially for the smaller operators, and although they were taking the big share of the market. What is your view on that kind of segment? And if you have any data from Europe or
I think it would be. I think there's good and bad news there. I think the good news is the product, the trust in the product will not be as great with an Airbnb as it would be with a hotel. Okay. So if you're running a hotel, people can see the maid cleaning the room. They can see that you have an infrastructure that is geared and organized towards providing cleanliness and safety in the hotel. So I think that this is a big advantage for hotels over Airbnb, and Airbnb can put on the internet all that they like about being safe and secure and recommendations to their owners. But at the end of the day, if the owner of the apartment doesn't want to do a nice job of cleaning it, or wants to save money by doing a poor job of cleaning, then they will do that. So I think the quality control issue is a point against Airbnb.
Okay.
On the positive side, I think that there is definitely a feeling that if you have your own apartment and you can control your own environment, it might feel a little bit more safe. So I think there's a very big opportunity here for serviced apartments in hotels, where it's run like an apart hotel, where you have a kitchen where people can cook for themselves. They don't have to go to a restaurant. They can be very autonomous. They can keep themselves they can stay in the room the whole time if they want to, or they can join in if they want to. So I think that this kind of product will do very well. I'm not sure that you have I think already Citadine in your market, or maybe one or two others. So I think these kind of products might find that they do quite well out of this crisis. But the pure Airbnb, I think that will be a long time before people are comfortable to use that again. I'm sure that will be. I'm sure people will choose a hotel over an Airbnb in the near future.
Okay. Another question we have about ADRs and occupancies. What do you think the strategies, or maybe you already see some strategies from the smaller or bigger operators? Do they want to keep the occupancy as high as possible by keeping the prices low, or they still have the old prices and they don't want to, let's say, hurt their profitability?
I think the balancing of the two is always it's as critical in a good time as it is in a bad time. During a good market, it's very important for getting your maximum yield and making your most amount of profit. In a bad market, it's very important for making sure you reach your break even and you optimize your profit opportunity. So there's never a case where you should be concentrating just on occupancy or just on rate. You've got to get a balance right. What I would say is, in these difficult times, all owners and operators always talk about how important it is not to have a price war and to bring down the overall market. But in reality, it always happens. So I think what people are saying is they want other people to not have a price war, but if I need to drop my price to get the business, I'm going to do it. So I think you will see some pressure on rates, kind of paradoxically. So the very early STR data that came out immediately after the crisis actually showed incredibly low occupancies, but very high average rates. But a lot of this was caused because the rates were artificially high because it was including cancellation revenue. So people who had a booking cancelled but no entitlement to a refund, this was going into the rooms revenue, and because there was fewer rooms, it looked like the average rates actually went up. So if you look at some of the STR graphs, because they only look at the hotels which are open, you will see the occupancies 10-20% and the average rate really good. But I think a lot of that is a false justification. So I would expect buyers, I think, will expect some discounts. So companies are all suffering, so they will want to make sure that their people that they send to stay in hotels are not paying too much for those hotels. And I think leisure people, everyone has a little bit less money than they did before the crisis. So I think people will be looking for bargains and deals. And as long as you come with a fair price, I mean, I don't think people will expect something for nothing, but they will be wanting to get a good price, a fair price. And I think if we keep the prices fair, I would imagine that people will start to return in greater numbers. And then once you have your occupancy built up, it's easier then to turn away some business in favor of better rates later.
Interesting. Thank you, Mark. Another question we have about casinos. As you probably know, we have a lot of casinos in Georgia, and especially on the seaside in Batumi.
Yep.
Occupancy rates especially are quite well dependent on the casino, let's say, market. Do you see any trends, or what is your thought on how the casino market might look like after, let's say, this COVID effects? And
I'm certainly not a specialist in casinos. I mean, we obviously have done work in hotels related to casinos, but what I would say is, if your casino has a lot of international visitors, then it's going to have the same impact as it did with hotels. So in other words, I would see that recovering much later than yeah. So I would see casinos not recovering too much this year, and probably starting the recovery next year, and maybe eventually gaining some traction as time goes on. Where the casino has a lot of domestic usage, maybe people will be very pleased to go and try and make up the salary they lost.
Yeah, sure. Okay, as we are coming to the end, I think we're just 1 minute over our scheduled time. Marc, what would be, in a few sentences, your suggestions for the Georgian operators, owners of the smaller hotels? Any views, any final remarks, comments?
Well, I think you've got to be unemotional about the timing of your opening. So everybody wants to get the hotel open and be seen to be the first to be open, but it's more important to do a right opening than a wrong opening. So I think it's very important that you make sure that you can see a clear way to your break-even point, and it's very important to know what your break-even point is, because that will be completely different. Every single hotel owner on this call will have a different break-even point. So it's very important for you to understand what is your break-even point, what would be your costs, and look at that in some detail. And then, okay, how much revenue do I need to cover that cost? How much is my marginal cost? Each additional member of staff that I bring in, how many extra rooms do I need to sell to cover that cost, etc. So I think it'll be very important to do that. I also think it'll be very important to look at phasing your opening. So maybe you open, first of all, your bedrooms, then your restaurants later, and maybe there's all sorts of different ways in which you could look at phasing the opening that will reduce your break-even point and enable you to get there quicker. And then the other thing is to keep optimistic, because I think the one thing that's very important, whenever there's a crisis, everyone is too pessimistic. Whenever there's a boom, everyone is too optimistic. So don't be too pessimistic. I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We will come through this, it will get better, and things will eventually return to normal. It may take a little bit longer than we had hoped, but it will eventually get there. And I mentioned to you earlier that somebody said to me something the other day, which I thought was a very good saying, which is, in the end, everything will be all right. And if it's not all right, it's not the end. So there you go.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you very much. And dear partners, friends, colleagues, thank you for participating. We had quite a few participants in Zoom and also on the Facebook. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will be posting a video recording of this conference, so you can all visit it on the recov.ge. And also, please subscribe to our newsletters. We'll be posting probably every other week new insights, new opportunities, new, let's say, data on the market that will help you all, of course, to make informed and educated decisions in this difficult and I would say very difficult to, let's say, project times. Marc, thank you for your time, and we hope to see you.
My pleasure. Yeah. Well, I hope to come. So when you get the bridge from the UK, I will definitely be there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Stay safe, and let's see you in Georgia soon.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye. Bye to everyone.